Welcome to the Aiming Five-Hole Podcast. Phil and Ryan here as usual. But before we get started, we need to address, as everybody knows, Ryan lives on the West Coast and lives in LA. And I'm glad you're here. And we talked a little bit about what we were going to do tonight, or if it's going to happen or not. But I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you and your family are safe. But I know you and all the people in LA are struggling with a lot of stuff going on there with these fires, which is just crazy. And I wish you guys and everybody in LA the best. But I'm glad you're here and I'm glad you're doing okay. Can't imagine what you're dealing with out there, dude.
Thanks, Phil. It's been a pretty wild week. It's a bit of an apocalyptic scene out here
Ugh,
for the
the
last few
images
days, but
on
things
the
seem to
images
be.
on news is just insane.
Yeah, it's been pretty nuts, and thankfully it feels like things are slowly coming under control, and life is making moves towards going back to normal. But I have a lot of friends and acquaintances who have lost everything and have
Mm,
to start over and figure out their lives from here. And and there's a really beautiful part of Los Angeles that is wiped off the map,
scary.
and don't know how they're going to rebuild it.
No.
Um, so, but knock on wood, I feel grateful that my family and I are at this point, safe from the damage, and my heart goes out to everybody who's suffering. And um, my all my best thoughts, all my best
Yeah.
wishes for everyone for a very quick recovery.
Absolutely. I can't say anything more better than that. So, again, best to you and everybody in LA. And let's see if we can talk a little hockey and try and have some fun for the next half hour and not think about it for a bit.
Absolutely. If I get a little
So,
snippier than usual on the Leafs, that's the reason why.
well, hey, look at you got a chance here to boast. Your Habs are have all of a sudden lit the world on fire here. 7-2-1 in the last 10, beat the last four Stanley Cup championships, then beat Vancouver, and then just took overtime, but beat Washington. Like they are seemingly doing really well, unfortunately, until they meet the Leafs next Saturday night. But we'll get to
Well, I think
that.
I think if I've said variations of this before in the last couple of weeks, but if you would have told me they would have had a back to back against Washington and Dallas and come out of it with 3 points, I wouldn't have believed you. So again, they're playing much better hockey. They're playing very structured hockey. They are killing. They're killing plays at both blue lines that in ways that they weren't doing at the beginning of the season. What I mean by that is they're stopping breakouts, turning pucks over at the offensive blue line, and they're doing a great job of killing plays and dump ins at their own blue line. And they are not giving up the same type of sustained pressure in their end that they were giving up earlier in the season. And they are not giving up the same kind, well, for the most part, they're not giving up the same kind of odd man rushes that they were giving up earlier in the season. It's literally a different team,
Yeah.
for all of the reasons that we've talked about in the past. You never feel like they're out of a game now. It used to be they give up the first goal or they go down 2-0 or whatever. It's like, forget it. It's over. It's going to be 7-1 before the game is over.
Right. And they did
But
some of that without Patrick Laine, who's now back, which is good.
who's
But
now back and got another power play goal
yeah.
last night. And, Cole Caulfield stepped up while Laine was out and went on a 5-game goal streak. Lane Hudson is playing like a 5-year vet at this point. He's just looking better and better and better with every game. Seeing him against Quinn Hughes in the same game was kind of fun. It was sort of a battle of these little light water bug type defensemen. And it's exciting when you think about, how the Canadiens are playing for the next couple of years with Suzuki and Caulfield and Laine, and the way Doc is playing now, and Ivan Demidov coming next year. It's very, very exciting.
Yeah.
The question is, how do you prep yourself, the best for success down there, but still taking advantage of the way you're playing now. We'll talk about the trade deadline later.
And I guess
Different
this
approaches
means
to
that
it.
Martin St. Louis can't shave his beard at this point now. He's stuck with this for the
No,
rest of the year.
well,
He's already in playoff mode with this beard already.
he's pretty fortunate in that he looks pretty good in it. So if he's stuck with it, it doesn't. It suits him.
Does that
So
dude age at all? He still looks like he could play.
he
He's in such
does.
good shape. He looks young. Other than his beard is white, he looks pretty good.
Well, remember when I think it was that very first Amazon Prime game, the Monday Night
Yeah,
Prime
yeah,
thing, and they did a weird interview with him when he was running the stairs
yeah.
at the Bell Center.
Such a,
And like,
it was so
now
odd,
it was really odd, but the thing that kind of
especially
stuck
the
out
ending
about
of
it
it.
was, yeah, the ending of it. But the what really stuck out about it to me was like the guy's running in shorts and his legs look like pistons. I mean, these huge calves and giant quads. Like, yeah, he looks like he could play tomorrow.
Yeah, he's pushing the right buttons at the moment, which is good.
Yeah, yeah. It's look, I still think that it will be difficult for Montreal to make the playoffs this year. There's a lot of teams
Oh,
clustered in that, and we'll talk about that again later. But they're playing great, and they're taking the step forward this season that I thought they would. And look, I said they'd be a 500 team. They're above 500. If they keep playing above 500 for the rest of the year, that's going to be ahead of where I thought they'd be, and that's great. I can't
that's good.
complain.
No, absolutely not. It's my turn, I guess, to be schizophrenic. Like,
Yeah,
the
you can go. You can go nuts.
the last 7 games, I look at the Leafs did what they needed to do that 5 game stretch we talked about a few weeks ago, the two against the Islanders, beat the Bruins, and then beat the Flyers. Wasn't all pretty, but they won all 5. I said they needed to win those 5. And then they go and start looking good against Carolina for the first 3 minutes, 5 minutes to get up 2-0, and then the ceiling caved in. They looked terrible the rest of the game. They started flying around their own end again like they were lost, and they carried that through into the game against Vancouver and lost 2 in a row. Now, again, I can't complain too much.
They
We're
gave
sitting
it.
in a good spot, but there are times they look terrible on their own end.
They got shut out by a team that could not stop wetting the bed, and they could let that team out of their losing streak on the road, no less. So
No, it's just bad.
that's you can't lose to Vancouver at home when Vancouver's lost every game on their road trip up to that point and playing like it
Just bad.
with a backup goaltender. I
Yes.
might add that's there's no.
And up until we get to the Habs on Saturday, we got a tough week because we play the Stars tomorrow night. We play New Jersey on Wednesday, and then we get to knock one out against the Habs in Montreal next Saturday, where we will both be dueling each other on the phones
Oh,
and the text exchanges. It'll be ugly for a little while. We
they'll
won't be able to talk on the podcast the expletives that are going to be going back and forth during that game.
yeah, it'll be a little bit nasty. But the good news is, we're due for that kind of
Yes.
that conversation. We've been way too nice to each other lately, and
Well, it'd also
it's
be 2-on-1 because Ron, being a Leaf fan, and people in the podcast that are listening have known we talk about this Ron dude. It'll be 2 of us on one, so
yeah,
you have to
true.
deal with both of us. Although Ron and I are going at it pretty much right now because he can't stand Ty Domi,
He just calls him Ty's son.
his son.
It's
He
Max
can't
Domi,
can't stand Domi, and I can't stand Robertson. So we're going back at it right now, back and forth.
which
But
is
look,
hilarious because they're playing on the same line
yeah,
essentially.
so and I'm not going to talk about it right now because I think I've got another trade in mind that I think the Leafs should consider it, but it'd be blasphemy to talk to about it at the moment. Because I'm off the Marner piece, there's another one I'd like to see happen. Maybe
oh,
using
oh,
that as
oh,
assets, but I'll tease that for another time because let's get
oh.
closer
Okay.
to that deadline. But the other thing that we haven't talked about all season, we talked about at the beginning as a team that was going to be nowhere, and suddenly we have not talked about Columbus all season long. And lo and behold,
They're in
in
a
the
playoff
last
spot.
10, they're 7-2-1. They've won 4 in a row, and they're sitting in a playoff spot. How did that happen?
Well, the two big reasons. The number one reason is nobody saw Zach Werenski becoming not a Calder, a Norris Trophy front runner. And I don't care what anybody says right now. Cale Makar, Quinn Hughes, blah blah blah. He's leading this team. He's playing
Absolutely.
amazingly. When the Canadiens played Columbus a couple weeks ago, like Zach Werenski dominated the game. The game went at the pace he decided it was going to go at. I mean, he's a fantastic player. I couldn't believe I hadn't seen him play that well before, and he seems like he's doing it night in and night out. Was he have 48 points to lead the team?
48 points leading the team. The defenseman closest to him in points on that team has got 19.
Yeah, I mean he they're looking. He's absolutely the number one player on that team. Now that the other thing that they've got going for them, and I want to give an honorable mention before I get to this. The Sean Monahan signing has been worth every penny to them.
Yeah.
He resurrected his career in Montreal. Montreal got that. It was the greatest trade ever, right? They took Sean Monahan off of Calgary's hands and got a first round pick for the favor of doing it.
Yeah.
And then Montreal goes ahead and turns around and trades him to Winnipeg for a first round pick, or was it a second round? I can't believe,
Right.
but for a high pick, right? And then he plays really well, continues to play really well in Winnipeg, and then God love him, turns that into a really solid signing with Columbus, and it worked out great for both teams. Monahan has continued to play well with
Right.
arguably inferior teammates than he had in Winnipeg, and
They're playing
Columbus is
with. Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
and
Finish.
Columbus is taking advantage of what a fantastic signing that's been for them. He's a center. He's what I think he's like plus 14 or something. He's plus a lot.
Yeah, and
Um,
where's plus minus? Where am I at?
um,
It doesn't have plus minus on here.
um,
Um, but it doesn't matter. But you're right. He's doing well and playing
he's
well, which
playing
is.
really, really well.
But he's also like one of the things I was going to mention. Sorry to interrupt you. Is that he's playing with a pretty heavy heart. Him and Johnny Gaudreau were buddies, very close buddies,
Yes,
and he seemingly has used that as motivation. The tragedy, obviously, that happened to Johnny and his brother. He's used that as motivation. The team is using that as motivation, much more than we gave the credit for. We thought that obviously that team was going to go through so much mental anguish and mental challenges getting over what happened. They are somehow finding a way to play well this year and maybe just using that as motivation.
yeah.
Does this team
So
have
he
a player on the team that has a other than Monahan and Johnson and Sillinger, do they have another player on this team that has a pronounceable name?
pronounceable. Well, that brings me to my second reason. I gave an honorable mention to Monahan. The second is the second main factor is the invisible Russians. Like, who the hell are Kirill Marchenko and Dmitry Voronkov? But they're both, you know, scoring a lot of goals. They've got
Yeah.
18 and 17 each. Never heard of either of them.
Nope.
The season went in and everybody was like, well, Adam Fantilli and Ken Johnson, take the next step forward and
Right.
have them improve. Well, guess what? Neither of those guys is playing particularly well, although, Ken Johnson has
Johnson's got
Ken
11
Johnson has
goals.
11 goals, but
Yeah.
but those aren't the guys that are the threat. And when I watch them play, Marchenko and Voronkov are like, they play like North Americans. Like, they're hard on the puck and in the
Right.
corners.
Well, we've
Um,
talked about this before, is that these players now are growing up and playing in the Canadian Hockey League, the Canadian Junior Hockey League.
yeah,
And we talked about this around the World Junior Tournament, is that these players now are playing a North American style. The
right.
North American style doesn't scare these guys anymore.
Yeah,
And more the Russians, the Swedish, Finnish, they're all playing a much tougher game.
yeah. And
Um,
I'll give one more. I'm going to give one more honorable mention, and it's as much a nod and a check in the box for Columbus as it is yet another dig at the Nashville Predators. But since he got traded over, or was it claimed on waivers? I think Dante Fabro was claimed on
I
waivers,
think he
and
was claimed on waivers.
he's a plus 14 for
Yeah,
Columbus.
that's pretty
Like he
amazing.
couldn't crack the lineup in Nashville, but he's playing awfully well
Yeah,
for Columbus.
yeah.
So
Kudos to them.
they're especially with average goaltending. Why don't you say his name? Because I know I can say his
Elvis,
name.
I got Elvis, no
You got
problem.
Elvis. What about this? What about the second part?
Why you do this to
I'll
me?
I'll,
It's
st-
Elvis.
I'll
It's
spawn you the
Elvis.
first four letters. It's Elvis Mers.
Merzlinskins.
Merzlikins. Very close. Very, very close.
Why do you do this to me? You knew this is the Russian and some of the European names are just beyond my grasp of pronunciation.
Well, look, the good news is as far as I can tell, there aren't any Finnish players on the Blue Jackets for you to screw up. So
Yep.
The ones with a lot of E's and A's are the ones that give you the most trouble.
Well, well, they've got these two rookies here that, I'm not even going to try and pronounce. I think you got the one guy, their leading goal scorer, Mikhail,
Marchenko.
no, Mikhail,
Oh, Pidia.
Papidia, and then
Yeah.
Luca Del Bel Beluza.
Del Bel, yeah. Well, they should just call him Bel Biv DeVoe, right? Like that'd
Just
be
call him
the
Taco
perfect nickname.
Bell. Just
Taco
call him
Bell.
Taco Bell. All
Um,
right. Oh, wow. No, it's funny. Look, it's good to see, obviously, with what Columbus has gone through, that they're in this position. Will they be there when everything shakes out? Who knows? But you also got to give it to all of a sudden Detroit. They've won seven in
seven
a
in a row.
row ever since McClellan. Their only loss in the last they're in those before that 7 game loss streak was to the Leafs. And since McClellan's comes in, they seem to have turned things around. They're a couple points out of the playoff spot. Now again, what happens? So between the Detroit Red Wings, Columbus is on a hot streak. Your Canadiens. We were talking this before we got on the podcast. Now all these teams are what we talked about last week in this mushy zone about, are they in the playoff race? Are they not in the playoff race? The East is so close, from the second wildcard spot where the Jackets are in right now at 46 points, all the way down to can go down to the Islanders at 41. That's only 5 points out at this point. There's still half a season to go. Who's buying? Who's selling? And what do these teams do? We're only 2 months away from the trade deadline on March 7th. And it's actually closer than you think, because almost 2 weeks of that is a break because of the Four Nations Challenge. So we are
Yep.
not as far away from this. And if last year is any indication, trades happened a lot sooner. It started in February, like early February, where stuff started to move because teams. But who's gonna be the first to move here? Because there's so many teams on that line of buyer seller. What do you do? What do you do as a Habs guy right now? You are on the cusp. You said they weren't going to make the playoffs. They have a good shot at making the playoffs. If you're the GM of this team, what would you do? And the GM just had an interview this week, which we both sort of caught and was an interesting.
Yeah, it was
Good.
very interesting. The two things that came out of it for me are he's setting up the team with two things in mind. Number one is we want to have long-term success, especially starting with what we really think are be our highly competitive window, which is like a year or two away. And then the second is you've got players that are buying in to your system and they're playing really well and they're seeing results. You want to reward them for that. And you want to make sure that you're sending a message that you want them to keep winning now.
Right.
So when you've got you've got basically three assets, possibly four in the next little bit that you can trade in Armia, Evans. Evans is the highest in demand, I think. Everybody wants Evans. I know the Maple Leafs would love to take a crack at Jake Evans. Christian Dvorak, who probably doesn't have a whole lot of value, and Josh Anderson, who's become a very valuable penalty killer. Like he and Armia are kind of the same guy at this point. Josh Anderson is more of the physical hitting and speed kind of player, off the rush kind of guy, although he's been sort of snake bit in terms of putting the puck in the net, although he had a nice shorthanded goal the other
So
night.
you're wavering. You're buying or you're selling? Come on.
Hang on. And then you got Joel Armia, who is just a beast in the corners, man.
Yeah.
He's a puck possession machine on the cycle, and I love it. So I think you do both. I think what you do is you're gonna have to live with Dvorak. I think maybe you trade him at the end of the year, because you've got Owen Beck coming up next year, and he's definitely going to have a slot in the roster. And then you choose one, you re-sign Evans. He's a long-term piece. He's 28. I think he's going to be very effective. Now, he's never going to score 20 goals. He's never going to have a 25% shooting percentage.
He's a
again.
role player. He's a great.
He's a role player,
at
and
the
he's
bottom
really
end of
good at it.
the bottom end of this of the bottom six, which
Yeah.
you said is where the Leafs are having a problem right now. Their bottom six are ineffective for the most part.
Yeah. Look, he's making 1.7. I think you can probably sign him for 3.5, and he'd be worth every penny. And then you make a choice between Josh Anderson and Yoel Armia, and I think you could go wrong. You can't go wrong with either one of them.
Right.
they're the kind of player that you can probably find at the trade deadline in a year, maybe 2 years. Um, you still have a logjam coming up on the blue line, but you don't have to deal with that this year. And so maybe you trade one of those guys either for an asset that can help you this year in terms of a hockey trade, or as Hughes said, you take a draft pick in 26, 27 so that your pipeline continues to be fed. You certainly don't
Right.
need a 25 draft pick. So I think they can't lose. They've got a lot of options. They could also choose to do nothing.
But
And
that's
I'd be fine with that.
you're obviously a long time Habs fan. That fan base is starving for the playoffs. And
Mm-hmm.
given the history and the franchise, you got to think the team's going to try and push it over the edge, right? To try and get it there, because maybe they're not going to compete for the Stanley Cup, but get him into the playoffs would mean a lot to the team and the franchise and the community in Montreal and whatnot. So I think they're going to do something. Martin St. Louis has grown his beard and he looks like he looks pretty good with that thing. So I don't think he's going to lose it till the end of the season at this point because I think he's going to try and keep it going.
Yeah. Yeah.
But so the Habs potentially buyers, maybe some sellers of
They
some
could do
assets.
both. They could
But
literally do both,
but
which
what
was
are the
real.
but the Penguins, Detroit, that you run the risk of what you said last week. Last week, Detroit was so close last year. They got on that run. We got so close to making the playoffs, so they decided to be buyers, and then they, up into the 7 game, we were writing them off up before the 7 game run they were on, and before they fired coach and brought in McClellan. So you run that risk if you do too much at the trade deadline. Are you, ruining but what you said there, got to be a hockey trade. It's got to make sense for not just now, but the future as well. And I think you're hearing a lot of that in the NHL right now. Hockey trade makes sense for the future, not just in the rental market. Rental market
Well,
seems to be
and
going away a little bit.
a little bit, especially because you've got an increase in the salary cap coming next year, so
Right.
people can afford to take on a little bit of term,
Right.
right? What's really interesting to me is you look at a Detroit and you look at Pittsburgh, and they've already badly depleted. Well, not badly. They've depleted their prospect pools a lot by making deadline trades the last 2-3 years.
Mm.
They're clearly both on the downslope. Do you do that again? And then really start to hurt yourself a little bit more for maybe a chance at getting in the playoffs and winning a round, maybe two.
Mm-hmm.
Or do you keep a little, powder in your gun for the future? Look at, we were talking about this before. Like, look at what Washington has been managed to do without hitting rock bottom, especially with the injuries they had to Nick Backstrom over the couple of years. They, had
Ovechkin's
not
aging, but he seems to be
Ovechkin's aging, but
resurrected.
yeah, and their sort of middling goaltending and middling defense, and lack of depth up front. Like, they should have tanked, but
Yeah.
they didn't. They found a way. They draft really, really well. They've got Blaine Hudson's brother in their farm system now, who was just
Yeah.
practically the MVP of the Junior World Championships. So,
Yeah.
um,
Well,
they're drafting well. They're picking up great reclamation projects, not even necessarily on the cheap, right? Like Dubois
right.
cost them.
A fortune.
Dubois, it cost them $4 million,
Right.
$8 million a year or something like that.
It was a risky move that paid off.
It paid off. Dylan Strome was a great move that paid off. Like, they've really now. Fair question as to how much of that is luck, right? Lots of teams do that kind of thing, and it doesn't always work out.
Well,
But
part of it's
they
coaching,
retooled
right?
on.
The
they
coach is being able
retooled
to
on the
bring this
fly.
group together, and he's got them playing. He's got a system that's working for the players he has in it.
Yes, but look at it this way: all of those moves were not made by, like, acquiring an asset at the deadline for number one draft picks and big prospects. They were kind of hockey trades.
Yeah, they
were
also
off-season moves. They were off-season hockey trades. The Dubois deal with LA was a good one. They signed Logan Thompson. They made the deal for Dylan Strome. Like, all of those were off-season moves that didn't cost them their future, and now they're looking good for the long term.
Right. And then there's one franchise that's not going to break your heart that's continuing to go the wrong way and is an exact example of what you were talking about. Boston is going in the wrong direction. and they've got no depth. They're an aging. They've lost a few key players last year to retirement. Bergeron obviously being the biggest, and their secondary. They lost DeBrusque. They lost a few pieces in the off season, and they've not been able to recover. They're dangerously close. We both said they're not going to make the playoff. There's a real chance they're not going to make the playoffs this year. And they just can't seem to get any secondary scoring. So are they going to be buyers or sellers? Or is it time for them to retool? Like maybe they retool. And again, a franchise that's not used to having to completely wipe the slate clean and go, they usually retool and stay good. We said at the beginning of the year, how did they all of a sudden stay so good? But now they seem to be like falling apart a little bit.
I think they have to do an off-season retool, because if they spend any future assets on rental stuff, rental players with really no chance of this squad winning the Stanley Cup, like Jeremy Swayman is not showing that he's like a Carey Price, from 7 or 8 years ago, where he could single-handedly drag a team to the late rounds of the playoffs or anything like that. That's just not going to happen with Boston, I don't think. And so they're going to have to make some off-season moves and just sort of let this season be what it is, I think. I feel like they are a team that has some potential to retool. They've got some pretty solid players.
Right.
They've made I think they overpaid for Zadorov. I think they definitely overpaid for Elias Lindholm, who did not become a true number 2 center or a true number 1 center for that matter.
No question. They've not been able to replace what they've lost.
Yeah.
And get the same return. And we talked about earlier that their bottom 6 guys or their sort of role guys are just not producing at the same clip they were last year. So, they've
the one thing that
riding a bad wave on several fronts.
Yeah. Well, the one thing that is very Boston is they have 2 players that are the top 2 penalty minutes leaders in the league. So Trent Frederick and the other guy.
The other guy.
The other guy.
No.
So yeah, it'll be an interesting trade deadline, and it'll be curious to see how early things get going, because I know with all of these teams clumped in the middle, both in the East and a few also in the West.
Yeah. St. Louis, Calgary. Unfortunately, Utah, Columbus,
Utah's making me sad.
They're kind of fallen off the last few weeks here, and
you can take the team out of Arizona, but you can't take the Arizona out of the team. Yeah, just a late season swoon.
Yeah, it's gonna be interesting. Like I said, the Leafs have got a tough week this week, and I'm looking forward to next Saturday's game. But the next month and a half, there's so many things that could happen. Like, who knows?
I'm excited. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool.
All right, man. Well, great talking to you this week.
Yeah, you too. And stay safe out there, right? Make sure that you guys are cautious, and all the best to you guys out there and everybody in LA, and good luck.
Thanks, buddy.
We'll talk to you next Saturday.
All right. Take care, man.
Bye-bye.